Good afternoon. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Tom McNaught, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you all for coming, especially those of you who are here for the first time, and acknowledge the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor, Bank of America, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, Raytheon, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe and WBUR. In a recent interview in the Wall Street Journal, Stephen King confessed, "I just write about what scares me. When I was a kid, my mother used to say, think of the worst thing that you can, and if you say it out loud, then it won't come true." And that's probably been the basis of my career. One of our country's most prolific and best-selling authors, Stephen King, has published 50 novels and written some 400 short stories, selling more than 350 million copies worldwide, and in the process likely causing countless others to have conversations with their mothers about how to keep their fears at bay. The winner of the 1994 O. Henry Award, Mr. King was recognized in 2003 by the National Book Foundation for his distinguished contribution to American letters, crafting stylish, mind-bending page-turners that contain profound moral truths, some beautiful, some harrowing, about our inner lives. I'm reminded of the words John F. Kennedy used to describe Robert Frost, whose contribution to our country, JFK suggested, was not to our size, but our spirit, not to our political beliefs, but to our insight, not to our self-esteem, but to our self-comprehension. If sometimes our greatest artists have been the most critical of our society, JFK went on, it is because their sensitivity and their concern for justice, which must motivate any true artist, makes him aware that our nation falls short of its highest potential. Words reminiscent of one critic's description of Stephen King's pungent prose, sharp ear for dialogue, disarmingly laid-back frank style, along with his passionately fierce denunciation of human stupidity and cruelty to others. There is, of course, no political litmus test to appear here at the Kennedy Library, but I was once in Mr. King's presence years ago when living in Down East Maine. We both attended a political benefit for then aspiring Democratic presidential nominee Paul Tsongas at Baldacci's restaurant in Mr. King's home city of Bangor. Maine plays a key role in many of Mr. King's books, including his newest novel, whose main character is a high school English teacher at Lisbon Falls High School, which happens to be Mr. King's alma mater, and a town that prides itself on being the birthplace of the sharply flavored soft drink known as Moxie. In thinking of the role geographic and physical surroundings play in informing an author's work, I was struck by Stephen King's recent review of our moderator, Tom Perrotta's newest novel, The Leftovers. Writing for the Sunday New York Times, Mr. King describes Tom Perrotta as, quote, a novelist who is to the suburban enclaves of America what Sherwood Anderson was to Ohio. The review goes on to praise Mr. Perrotta's beautifully modulated narration for its calm and unshowy clarity. Tom Perrotta is a novelist and screenwriter, best known for his novels Election and Little Children, which were made into critically acclaimed Academy Award-nominated films. We thank both Stephen King and Tom Perrotta for being here with us today. You honor us with your presence. The Kennedy Library is home to Ernest Hemingway's papers, and in securing a deed for those materials, it was Jacqueline Kennedy's great hope that this institution would serve as a center celebrating the best of American arts, culture, and literature. Let me conclude with a few words from Janet Maslin's review of Mr. King's new book, 11/22/63, which is not officially released until tomorrow, but is on sale in our bookstore today. In this new novel, Ms. Maslin writes, Stephen King pulls off a sustained high-wire act of storytelling trickery. Perhaps it's the gravity of the Kennedy assassination that makes this new book so well-grounded. But in any case, the pages of 11/22/63 fly by, filled with immediacy, pathos, and suspense. It takes a great brazenness to go anywhere near this subject matter, but it takes great skill to make this story even remotely credible. Mr. King makes it all look easy, which is surely his book's fanciest trick. In other words, true to his roots, the man's got moxie. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Stephen King and Tom Perrotta to the Kennedy Library.
Let me just begin by saying what an honor it is for me to be here with Stephen King. He's a living legend. I think the one writer I think that basically everybody knows. I mean, we don't have a common literary culture. I think there might be, J.K. Rowling and Stephen King. And I've noticed this, if I'm at a table, it's very hard to get everybody talking about an individual writer. But just the other day, I was mentioning that I was going to talk with Stephen King at this event, and suddenly everybody had an opinion. Everybody had their favorites, but it was a common body of work that everybody knew, and I think that's just an extraordinary thing in the fragmented culture that we live in. And so anyway, I'm really thrilled to be here and to be celebrating the publication of 11/22/63, which is a remarkable book. And I think Stephen's going to begin by reading a short section.
Yeah, I'm going to read, and I'm actually going to stand up at the podium, because if you read standing up, it lends some authority that otherwise might be missing. So, I don't know if this will even work. What if I do this? No. But you can hear me without it. Anyway, I'm going to read for about 10 minutes, and then Tom and I are going to talk, and I look forward to that. But very briefly, this is a story about a man named Jake Epping, the narrator, who discovers that there is a fissure in time that goes back to 1958, and that if somebody were brave and dedicated enough, it might be possible to go back to September of 1958 and live those intervening years and stop the Kennedy assassination. And the person who tells him about this is a man named Al Templeton, who owns a diner, who's discovered this, actually, when he moved his diner to Lisbon Falls, Maine, which was not the birthplace of Moxie. They just survive on it now. Nastiest drink other than NyQuil in the world. Anyway, in this little section, they're discussing Al Templeton went back to 1958, stayed there for about 4 years, got lung cancer, and came back to find another volunteer to do this. And they're discussing the possible ramifications of doing that. Al begins by mentioning the butterfly effect, and Jake says, right, it means small events can have large, Jake says butterfly effect. Al says it means small events can have large, ramifications. The idea is that if some guy kills a butterfly in China, maybe 40 years later or 400, there's an earthquake in Peru. Does that sound as crazy to me as it does to you? It did, but I remembered a hoary old time travel paradox and pulled it out. Yeah, but what if you went back and killed your own grandfather? He stared at me baffled. Why in the hell would I want to do that? That was a good question, so I told him to go on. You changed the past this afternoon in all sorts of little ways just by walking into the Kennebec Fruit. But the stairs leading up into the pantry and back to 2011 were still there, weren't they? And the falls is the same as when you left it. So it seems, I said, yes, but you're talking about something a little more major than just a trip to get a root beer, to wit, saving JFK's life. Oh, I'm talking about a lot more than that, because this ain't some butterfly in China, buddy. I'm also talking about saving RFK's life, because if John lives in Dallas, Robert probably doesn't run for president in 1968. The country wouldn't have been ready to replace one Kennedy with another. You don't know that for sure, I said. No, but listen, do you think that if you save John Kennedy's life, his brother Robert is still at the Ambassador Hotel at 12:15 in the morning on June 5th, 1968? And even if he is Sirhan still working in the kitchen? Maybe, I thought, but the chances were awfully small. If you introduced a million variables into an equation, of course, the answer was going to change. Or, Al said, what about Martin Luther King? Is he still in Memphis in April of '68? Even if he is he still standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel at exactly the right time for James Earl Ray to shoot him? What do you think? Well, I said, if that butterfly thing is right, probably not. That's what I think, too. And if MLK lives, the race riots that followed his death don't happen. Maybe Fred Hampton doesn't get shot in Chicago. Who? He ignored me. For that matter, maybe there's no Symbionese Liberation Army, no SLA, no Patty Hearst kidnapping. No Patty Hearst kidnapping, a small but maybe significant reduction in black fear among middle-class whites. You're losing me, I said. Remember, I was an English major. I'm losing you because you know more about the Civil War in the 19th century than you do about the one that ripped this country apart after the Kennedy assassination in Dallas. If I asked you who starred in The Graduate, I'm sure you could tell me. But if I asked you to tell me who Lee Oswald tried to assassinate only a few months before gunning Kennedy down, you'd go, huh? Because somehow all that stuff has gotten lost. Oswald tried to kill somebody before Kennedy. This was news to me, but most of my knowledge of the Kennedy assassination came from an Oliver Stone movie. In any case, Al didn't answer. He was on a roll. Or, what about Vietnam? Johnson was the one who started all the insane escalation. Kennedy was a cold warrior, no doubt about it, but Johnson took it to the next level. He had the same "my balls are bigger than yours" complex that W showed off when he stood in front of the cameras and said, "Bring it on." Kennedy might have changed his mind. Johnson and Nixon were incapable of that. Thanks to them, we lost 60,000 American soldiers in Nam. The Vietnamese, North and South, lost millions. Is the butcher's bill that high if Kennedy doesn't die in Dallas? I don't know, I said, and neither do you, Al. That's true, but I've become quite the student of recent American history, and I think the chances of improving things by saving him are very good. And really, there's no downside. If things go bad, you just take it all back, like erasing a dirty word off a chalkboard. Or maybe I can't get back. You never know. Thank you. There's a lot more. The book is 850 pages long.
Well, let me start by asking you this. This book has, like many of your books, just an incredibly bold premise. You know, a man from our moment in time goes back to 1958, has to live in the past for 5 years to get to the point where he can undo the Kennedy assassination. And you know, I just wondered if there's any point would you as a writer just stop and say, what the hell did I get myself into? I mean, it seems like a kind of a crazy crackpot idea, and a more cautious writer would say, how could I possibly do this? And I wonder, do you have those doubts? Do they fuel your work?
Well, this guy's talking about bold premises. His book, which is out now, The Leftovers, is about the rapture, okay? Everybody gets raptured, and this book is about people in suburbia who left. So he's a great one to talk about bold premises. But
I'm full of doubt.
So I know. Were you full of doubt when you
yeah.
wrote it? Okay. I just get knocked out by the idea. You know, I had this idea originally in 1971 or 1972. I was teaching high school, and it was November 22nd. And at that time, this was a really big deal. It came around, and it was like the 10-year anniversary of 9/11. And this book, which is called 11/22/63, was sitting on somebody's desk at the publishers, and one of the young people came by and said, well, what's that date? A person didn't know, but you'd know 9/11. So somebody just said, what would it be like if Kennedy had lived? And we were blue skying that a little bit, and I thought it would make a terrific book. For me, the doubts came because there was so much research involved. And the other thing is, like, you know you're not going to get everything right, that somebody is going to pop up out of the woodwork and say, well, you got this wrong, or you got that wrong. And I'm not even talking about all the people who will say, well, this whole thing is bullshit because there was a shooter on the grassy knoll and another one with a periscope and this and that and the other thing. So there are all the conspiracy people.
So that's what stopped you in the 70s?
the amount of research was really what stopped me. It just seemed like an enormous project, and I really wasn't ready. I didn't have the chops to do it.
Did you start it and stop?
I did. I wrote about 25 pages. I got all the stuff about the diner and how nobody in town would go there. They call it, Al Templeton has a specialty, which he calls Al's Famous Fat Burger, and people in Lisbon Falls call it Al's Famous Cat Burger, because the price is so low. There are all these rumors, but what he's doing is he's using his time portal to go back to 1958 and buy ground beef at 58 prices, you know. And so, again, you know, it's a matter of research. You go and you get remember too, Tom, there were no computers. There was no Google or anything. You actually had to go to the library and research this stuff.
Yeah. That would have been
You're too
tough.
young to remember.
No,
but
I'm not. That would have been tough.
It was, which is why I gave it up. But you know what I mean. I had never tried to do anything like this. I'm not a historical novelist, and I never really aspired to be one. And you know, I never forgot a review that I read of James Michener's book. I think it was Chesapeake, where the reviewer said, "I have two pieces of advice about this book. The first one is don't read it. The second is if you do read it, don't drop it on your foot." And that's the kind of thing that, and the thing about those Michener books is they're so heavy on the history, and I didn't really want to do that. I didn't want to trot out a lot of knowledge and shove it. I want to tell a story. That's what I do.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, the thing that really struck me in reading the book was that you could go long stretches and not really think about Oswald or JFK. And to me, this is the master stroke. Jake can only get back to a certain day in 1958, so 5 years before the Kennedy assassination. He's got to create a life for himself.
A life, yeah.
And so it becomes a kind of espionage novel. He's like an undercover operative from the future, and he's got to hide this. And that's my favorite part of the book, I think. And it's really about private life. And in a sense, the book becomes, you know, a kind of meditation on what we owe to the public world and to history, what we owe to
ourselves.
To ourselves.
Yeah. There's a thing in the early, you know, I just had, with the time travel part of it, I didn't want to jam that down anybody's throat either, because it's just a device to try to have a modern guy in a time that to a lot of people now, 1958 seems like ancient history, the way that the 20s felt to me when I was a kid growing up and I'd read about the Roaring '20s. I'd think, ancient history. And I think a lot of people feel that way now about the 50s and 60s. But since I now qualify for a senior discount at the movies, to me it seems like it was just recently. But there's a point where he goes back for the first long stay, and he's been told, like you said, the secret agent thing, he's got to be wearing a certain kind of pants. The haircut has got to be a little bit shorter in back than he's got it. And he's got the money from the 50s and all that. And when he goes back, he realizes that he's tried to use a modern copper sandwich dime and a payphone, and it doesn't work. And he's carrying his cell phone, which wouldn't be too good. You'd wind up probably in a prison somewhere as a visitor from space.
Well, and you know, so much of a historical novelist job is to weed out anachronisms, to figure out, you know, what would people say in 1958, what would they say in 1963, what would they say, you know, at any given point. And it becomes a really funny thread throughout the book, is, you know, when Jake blurts out some idiom that wasn't invented, and the kind of
he gets in trouble with his
gets.
girlfriend too, because he's thinking about something else, and he starts singing "Honky Tonk Women" by the Rolling Stones. I met a gin-soaked barroom queen in Memphis. She tried to take me upstairs for a ride. She blew my nose, and then she blew my mind. And he's with his girlfriend, and when he gets home, she says, "Where did you hear that?" And he says, "Oh, it's something I heard on K-Life," which is one of the rock stations at the time. She says, "No radio station in America could play a song like that. They'd be banned by the FCC, which was true.
Yeah,
at that
especially
time.
in Texas and.
Especially in Texas, that's right.
Well, I think this would be a good time to just ask, because you clearly did a ton of research. And, yeah, you do that so that nobody can say, hey, you made a big mistake and I no longer believe you or trust you as a writer. But there's also, I think, in the course of synthesizing all that research, I wondered, did your sense of the past, of John F. Kennedy's importance to American history, the centrality of the assassination, did any of those things change as a result of all this research and this immersion?
I saw Kennedy more as a man as a result of some of the footage that I looked at. That's one of the great, benefits of the computer, is that a lot of this archive footage is available. And the thing that stuck out in my mind the most was I found a video of him in Tampa and Miami. This was just days before the Dallas trip. And he did all the things that the politicians do, the grip and grin kind of thing. And it gave me a chill to see him in that same car with the same open top. And he goes into the crowd, and the Secret Service agents are just kind of looking at each other like, what do we do now? There were barriers, almost like the ones that you see sometimes between lanes when the highway's under construction, and there was a gap. He slips through the gap and he starts to shake hands, and the agents are kind of like, oh man, I don't know what to do now. And they're the same agents that were surrounding him days later in Dallas. But the thing that I really liked was that they showed him at a political function that night, and there's a guy in alpine shorts with the suspenders and the lederhosen and the alpine cap, and he's playing Hail to the Chief on the accordion. And Kennedy comes in, and there's this kind of like, holy shit minute, like this guy, I can't believe it. And I had to put it in the book, because at that second you see Kennedy the man just going like, how bizarre this is, this world that I'm in, like us doing this right now. So I got a picture of him as a man. And the other thing was I got a chance to, Kennedy is a peripheral figure to this book, in the sense that Jake is trying to stop the assassination. The person that I really wanted to try and bring forward and kind of delineate was Lee Oswald, because he was the change agent, not Kennedy. That's the pity of it, because Kennedy, up until that moment, had been this real change in American politics and the way that we did business up to that time. The difference was, Eisenhower showing up at the inauguration in a silk top hat and a morning coat, and Kennedy is bareheaded, and he's got this beautiful thick head of hair, and you could tell that it was the changing of the guard, and that things weren't going to change except for this guy with a rifle. And so I was interested in trying to make him exist as a character.
Yeah, and you really do. And in fact, such a jolt in the book when Jake actually has some interaction with Oswald and his wife Marina. And you get that charge that you get in really good fiction, where history just erased. You're seeing them the way you see anybody in this novel. There's also a lot, speaking of the secret agent stuff, there's a lot of interesting surveillance. And, and we get access to Oswald's house.
When you talk about, you remember when you asked me, did you ever have doubts? I'll tell you what, there's a guy sitting in the front row here. His name is Russell Dorr, and he was my research assistant on this book. And he saved my ass so many times in the course of doing this. But I had I had my own holy shit minute when I thought to myself, I want to put Jake in a position where he can see Oswald and hear Oswald. And then I realized that when he's in Fort Worth, he and his wife spoke nothing but Russian, because Lee met her in Russian and she had no English, And he had no interest in letting her learn English because he wanted her under his thumb. So not only is Jake in a different house, but they're speaking a different language. And I did have this sort of reaction that I'd gotten into this. So I started to look into bugging equipment. My friend Russ helped me, and we found out what was possible and what wasn't. And he gave me the information, and then I did what they pay us the big bucks for, which is to try to make something real out of that. And
Yeah.
I did. I had some fun with it.
Well, I think it's amazing from a writerly perspective. I mean, that's one of these unlikely things that you're able to do. You're able to get him traveling back in time. You set up a lot of rules that make your job much more difficult. You say, okay, you can only go back to this one day in 1958. And then there are a whole...
2 minutes before noon on September 9th, 1958.
And-
Every trip is the first trip.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's Groundhog Day.
And then there's also, how are we going to hear what goes on in Oswald's room? And you figure out a way to do this, and you never look back, and I think the reader just follows you anywhere, which is, I think, the sign of a real master at work. So I mean, I understand that you have doubts and you have to conquer them in some way, but for the reader, I think you just find yourself going along for the ride and find...
Step one is you get the information by hook or by crook. I had Russ to help me with some, and of course I have access to the computer and stuff. And then you just kind of make stuff up that'll make it work. But one of the things that I found out that interested me, you have to remember that this was the time of transistor radios, where you put the little button in your ear. They were kind of like, for those of you who are the younger set, they were like iPods with only a single pod kind of thing. And you listen to the radio. But one of the things that I found out was that the people who made all the really good stuff back then, all the good spy stuff, were the Japanese. So, and they made the transistor radios, and that was great. And one of the other things that happens in the course of it that my research assistant got me, one of the great advantages of coming from 2011 to 1958 and being there for 5 years is you would know who won every athletic competition that people bet on. So.
It's a scam. Time travel.
Yeah, the whole thing's a scam.
Now, one thing I'll say, there are advantages in 2011, but 1958 has its advantages in the book. And I mean, one of the things that really suffuses the book is a kind of nostalgia for that golden time. And I know that that's built into the book because the Kennedy assassination becomes a kind of fall, and it's the end of a idyllic time in America. But also, it felt really heartfelt. Food tasted better, the air smells better, people are nicer, the pace of life is slower. And I just wondered if this is something that you share, or if it's just a part of the book.
Well, you having said that, I want to read something else here. It's short, but it speaks to what you're talking about. And the idea was to try to balance off. I really didn't want to do nostalgia in this book. I didn't really want to get that soft focus, Vaseline on the lens kind of thing. I wanted to try and balance it off. One of the things that you have to remember is that if you did go back from 2011 to 1958, you would know that the world wasn't going to end in a thermonuclear blast. One of the sections of the book has to do with a woman who almost commits suicide during the Cuban Missile Crisis because she's convinced that the world is going to end. And the advantage that we would have, other than knowing that the Pirates were going to beat the Yankees in 7 in 1960, is, and be able to bet on it and get great friggin' odds, is that the mushroom cloud wasn't going to go up. But I tried to balance these things off. So this is Jake headed for Dallas from Maine. I took US 1 south. I ate a lot, had a lot of roadside restaurants featuring mom's home cooking, places where the blue plate special, including fruit cup to start and pie a la mode for dessert, cost 80 cents. I never saw a single fast food franchise, unless you count Howard Johnson's with its 28 flavors and Simple Simon logo. I saw a troop of Boy Scouts tending a bonfire of fall leaves with their scoutmaster. I saw women wearing overcoats and galoshes taking in laundry on a gray afternoon when rain threatened. I saw long passenger trains with names like the Southern Flyer and Star of Tampa charging toward those American climes where winter is not allowed. I saw old men smoking pipes on benches in town squares. I saw 1 million churches and a cemetery where a congregation at least 100 strong stood in a circle around an open grave singing the old rugged cross. I saw men building barns. I saw people helping people. 2 of them in a pickup truck stopped to help me when my Sunliner's radiator popped its top and I was broken down by the side of the road. That was in Virginia around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and one of them asked me if I needed a place to sleep. I guess I can imagine that happening in 2011, but it's a stretch. And one more thing. In North Carolina, I stopped to gas up at a humble oil station, then walked around the corner to use the toilet. There were 2 doors and 3 signs. Men was neatly stenciled over one door, ladies over the other. The 3rd sign was an arrow on a stick. It pointed toward the brush-covered slope behind the station. It said, colored. Curious, I walked down the path, being careful to sidle at a couple of points where the oily green shading to maroon leaves of poison ivy were unmistakable. I hoped the dads and moms who might have led their children down to whatever facility waited below were able to identify those troublesome bushes for what they were, because in the late 50s, most children wear short pants. There was no facility. What I found at the end of the path was a narrow stream with a board laid across it on a couple of crumbling concrete posts. A man who had to urinate could just stand on the bank, unzip, and let fly. A woman could hold onto a bush, assuming it wasn't a poison ivy or poison oak, and squat. The board was what you sat on if you had to take a dump, maybe in the pouring rain. If I ever gave you the idea that 1958's all Opie and Andy, remember the path, okay? The one lined with poison ivy and the board over the stream. And that's the other side.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a very powerful passage, and I remember it well. And there's also, of course, a big component of the book is a love story. Jake goes back to 1958 and eventually makes his way to a small town in Texas named Jody, gets a job teaching with forged documents that nobody checks because it's 61 at that point?
He gets his teaching certificate from a degree mill.
Oh. And you know, he starts this affair with this sort of gawky, charming librarian. And it's interesting, right, because it's the era where they can't really sleep together openly. But one thing you notice is that there is a kind of sexual revolution sort of, you know, bubbling up. People who get to know them will cover for them. And there are these, you know, gay guys who have a discreet motor court, right?
Bungalows, yeah.
So I thought that was, you know, we could just see history in that as well.
Well, one of the things that happens here is she does, they do have this sexual relationship that develops, and she doesn't have a diaphragm, and at that time, birth control pills were dispensed to married women. Okay, if you were a single lady and you went into a doctor's office and tried to get birth control pills, you wouldn't get them. They weren't allowed, and the diaphragm that she did have, she doesn't have anymore. So she tells Jake to get condoms, but to be sure not to get them at the local drugstore because they would be fired. They would lose their jobs, and he has to be very, very careful about not staying too late at her place and that sort of thing. And I think that a lot of younger people today who grew up with co-ed dorms and co-ed bathrooms and all the rest find it hard to believe that we existed in a world of parietal hours and where women were in serious trouble if they transgressed the rules that had anything that smelled of sexuality. That's another side of that time. There are a lot of aspects to the 50s and 60s, particularly pre-Beatles. That was the other thing here, is that the Beatles changed a lot, and that whole culture changed a lot. And I was always sorry that Kennedy missed that, because I think that he would have been a fan. I think he would have dug the Beatles.
Well, Bobby got to live that
Yeah.
journey.
Yeah.
I just saw that documentary where he went to South Africa,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just interesting to see, you know, how much he'd been transformed in those 4 years, and how much counterculture he
Yeah.
had taken in, and how much the language
Was
of the
Bobby
counterculture.
Kennedy on record about the Beatles?
I don't know.
Does anybody know?
Somebody here knows.
Please tell me Bobby Kennedy wasn't a Rat Pack guy. That would be terrible. But
He loved the monkeys, I'm told.
yeah. Oh dear.
So, as Tom said before, you've written over 50 books. You know, some of them are masterpieces and cultural touchstones. You know, everybody has either seen the movie version, read them. They're part of our lives. They're part of the culture. Is that a burden to you sometimes when you take on a book like this? Do you think, do you compare it to other works that you've done? Do you think I have to beat that one?
Yeah. It isn't really a burden, but I certainly have gotten a reputation as the horror writer, and I never said, yes, that's what I am, and I never said, no, that's what I'm not. I felt that as long as I was writing what I wanted to write, that's a terrific gift, to be able to sit and write what it is that you want to write and not have to do a lot of directed stuff. To actually be able to support your family, and it's sort of guilt-free, because you're kind of in the playground. You're making all this stuff up that's what you want to make up, and you say, yeah, but I'm actually paying the light bill while I do this, so that's a great thing. But sometimes it does pop up. We live in Florida in the wintertime. We didn't really want to go, but we turned 60 and we had to, it's the law. So we got a little place that's near Sarasota, and the deal that I worked out with my wife was that she would do the big shopping things, and then if we needed anything else in the week, I was supposed to go and get it. So I was doing that one weekday, and I was going up the aisle with the housewares, and this woman came the other way. I'm going to say she was 120. You know, there's a certain Florida woman that's sort of like skin wrapped on an armature. You know they're going to last a long time. Outlive 2 or 3 husbands or whatever. And no governor on this lady's mouth. She's coming at me and I'm going at her, and she says, I know who you are. You write those scary stories. Well, I don't read those horror stories. I like uplifting things like that Shawshank Redemption. So I said, I wrote that, and she said, no, you didn't. That was it. That was the whole discussion. So, you know, I think it would be great if some people came to this book who are history buffs, who are interested in the Kennedy years. I don't know if that will happen or not, but I think it would be terrific. But I don't set out to write any particular thing for any particular audience. I don't think you do either, do you?
No, I don't, and I would love to have your audience.
Yeah, but there are plenty of people who would love to have your audience, too. We're going to fight. We're going to roll around. This is going to be like big-time author wrestling.
we were just up in the Hemingway room, so we feel like a fist fight would be good for our reputations. Right. Also, we're going to pose shirtless later.
Come on, Hemingway would kick our ass. You know it's true.
I'll bring it on.
Yeah, bring it on.
So, you know, you write, I mean, on the one hand, I think of you as a kind of a working class guy and a working class writer, and you write really well about small town, working class life. But then you do something else that I think I often associate with a very different kind of writer, which is you write about writing. Mm-hmm. You are, a meta writer on some level. You have many characters who are writers. And I usually think of that as being I'm always wary when they're writer characters, but your writer characters feel like working writers to me, and not so much like, rarefied literary intellectuals. And the other thing that comes through, I think, is just this utter love of writing. I was recently was reading The Green Mile, which I think is just an amazing book, and there was this quote that, let me see if I can find it on my notes here. The narrator says, "What I didn't realize was how many doors the act of writing unlocks, as if my dad's old fountain pen wasn't really a pen at all, but some strange variety of skeleton key." And I think there are comments like that throughout your work, and a lot of times narrators are writing the book that we're reading. And I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of writers see writing as a burden, this thing that they've taken on that is oppressing them, but they've got to get it out, and it's a arena of struggle. And I just wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
Well, the whole thing about the writer who sees the job as a burden and something that they struggle along, it makes me think there was an album by a rock artist named Todd Rundgren. It was called The Ever Popular Tortured Artist Effect. And I sometimes think that writers draw this cloak of the tortured artist around them because A, you can get free drinks, and B, chicks love it. They love that tortured thing going on. But I've always thought that it was a terrific job, and I've always felt very, very fortunate, blessed really, to be able to do it. Because I do it for free if I couldn't do it for money, but I love doing it for money. That sounds kind of nasty, doesn't it? I love doing it for money. But I read early on, and probably you did too, write about what you know. And I know about the writing life because I've been a writer for a lot of years, and I know a little bit about the teaching life. One of the pleasures of 11/22/63 is Jake's secret identity is he becomes a high school teacher, and that was a good thing to revisit because I have a lot of good memories about teaching. There were a lot of things about it that were great. Did you teach yourself?
I did. I taught mostly college, but I also ended up writing a lot about teachers. I do. I mean, I like
parts of it.
I like the close interaction with students. I didn't like grading papers, but.
And I didn't like grading papers. I didn't like a lot of the administration and a lot of the politics.
Which is probably a lot worse now than when you taught.
But I liked the kids, and that was great. That was very refreshing. So I've written about those things, and I've written about a few other jobs. I just try to be careful. I don't think that writing as an act is very interesting to very many people, and I don't know, it's like I've shown people where I write, interviewers and people like that, and they're always a little bit disappointed, like, where's the magic? Well, there isn't. It's a desk and a word processor and a bunch of sticky notes stuck around and a lot of clutter, that sort of thing. But the magic is somewhere else. So I can write about the act of writing a little bit, but the real story has to be somewhere else, I think. Mm-hmm. In the case of Misery, which was about a writer who's taken prisoner by his #1 fan, the real interest is sort of in that relationship, the dynamic between the sane person who happens to be a writer and the crazed fan.
Mm-hmm. And that obviously was some struggle you were sensing in your own mind or your own career, maybe, that fans wanted something.
I think that you sense that, but the other thing that I discovered, you write books to find out how you feel about things. Don't you think that's true to a degree?
Yeah. Well, if you start out knowing and you end up knowing the same thing you started with, it's going to be a bad book, I think.
Yeah, that's right. You got to know more. a little bit more than when you started. You got to have a different view of it. And one of the things is, like, if you spend all that time to write a book, you ought to be able to come out with something more important than a paycheck, because you have to live a life too. So in the case of Misery, what Paul Sheldon finds out is that that Annie Wilkes, in a way, is sort of expressing to him that what he's really good at is writing these bodice ripper romances, and he better stick to what he's good at. It's kind of sad, but there it is.
Well, we got some questions from the audience, but first let me just then ask you, if it's not too hard to sum up, because it's such a big novel that tackled such big issues, what did 11/22/63 reveal to you that you didn't know at the beginning?
Well, the first thing is probably not to write another historical novel. But I think what it taught me is that it's possible to appreciate your own time, and it's possible to get some perspective on the past by trying to relive it. Obviously, nobody can go back and change the events of the past, but I certainly felt enriched by the time that I spent rediscovering the 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, so here we go. You say you've made a career of writing about what scares you. What scares you now?
Oh man, being in front of all these people is, you know, I don't know how you feel. I asked you beforehand if you were nervous, and the thing is, like, we sit in a room. That's what
I'm
we
nervous,
do.
by the way.
We sit in a room, you know, to make our daily bread, but so being in front of a bunch of people, but on a more mundane level, I guess, you know, I'm afraid that when I get to the hotel, there might be a lunatic in the shower stall, something, you know. You wouldn't think so, but think of all the pass keys they have in all those hotels. And I don't know.
You heard it here first.
I'm a fearful person by nature, I think. So I'm always I survive pretty well. I'm afraid that after the way that the Red Sox finished last season, that, well, I mean, for a horror writer, the Red Sox are a natural in a way. I'm basically evading the question because the subject of what frightens me is just like everything.
Well, you made it work.
That's good.
Here's a good one. Have you thought about the possibility of building a Stephen King library in the future in Bangor, Maine, or elsewhere?
Oh, I don't think that I'd want any kind of a place that was filled with my stuff. That would be, that's a little bit, that'd make me feel sort of conceited or puffed up, kind of like the Goodyear blimp. My wife and I have a foundation, and we try to support as many libraries as we can, because I feel like they're very important resources in communities, and they meant a lot to she and I when we were younger, because we didn't really have any money, either one of us, and we loved books, and that's where you go to get the books. So, but a library of just my stuff, I think that'd be a pretty boring library. We could put in some of your stuff as well.
Well, I'd be happy to be there. But, you know, we were just up in the Hemingway room upstairs, and I must say that there's something kind of thrilling about seeing, you know, handwritten pages from Hemingway, or, you know, correspondence that he had with Fitzgerald. I mean, you're, in a sense, you know, you're part of American, you know, you will be part of American literary history. So, you know, I know that's not, you know, that's obviously, somebody will do it if you don't.
It's crazy to think of that. You know, one of the things that I noticed in the Hemingway room was that the editor had suggested at the end of do you remember which novel it was? Farewell to Arms, maybe?
Yeah, yeah. And
The editor had said, it's magnificent, it's terrific. And by the way, I have at least one editor here today, and I can tell you for every writer that when you get a letter from an editor that starts out by saying, thank you for this wonderful, terrific book, it just totally blew me away, that the rest of the letter is going to be all the shit that you're supposed to fix. You know? So at the end of this particular manuscript, this letter, the editor had said things to change. Hemingway has written, you can see this upstairs for yourself. He's written, kiss my ass. And he's put it in a circle. But there's a story about that. You know, we were talking about misery. And my wife and I and the kids were in England for a week. And on the ride over, I fell asleep and I kind of had this dream about this woman who took a writer prisoner and skinned him and bound a final book in his skin. And I thought, there's a real story here, which I called the Annie Wilkes edition. And that was the beginning of misery. And when we got to the hotel, which was Brown's Hotel in London, I couldn't sleep because of the time change. My wife was knocked out, the kids were asleep. And I went downstairs and I asked if there was a place where I could write. And the guy said, oh, yes, sir, we would be very pleased to have you. And he took me up on the landing between the ground floor and what the Brits call the first floor. There was this beautiful desk there. And he said to me, this was Rudyard Kipling's desk. And I said, I could never write at this. And he's like, British. He's like, oh, I insist, you must write at Rudyard Kipling's desk. And I'm like, okay. So I sat down and I started to write Misery at Rudyard Kipling's desk. And they brought me, you know, buckets and oodles and buckets of tea, and I'm writing and drinking tea. And then toward the end, when I'd gotten about everything I could get and I felt like I could sleep, the hotel manager came up again and said, did I tell you Kipling died at this desk? He had a stroke and dropped dead at his desk. And that was
one more thing to be scared of.
one more thing to be scared of, that's right. And someday there's a place waiting for me, for you too, where people will say, this is where he dropped.
And would you like to have a seat? This question came with a supplement. What did you think of your future prospect of a writer when you published your first book?
Oh, I didn't have any idea. I'll tell you what. The first book was Carrie, and the advance for Carrie was $2,500. And my wife said, she said, don't make any big plans for that money, Steve. We have to buy a car. And we did. We bought a Ford Pinto, as a matter of fact. It was snot green. It was the only one they had. It was a Standard. She couldn't drive a Standard. But we were very excited. You know, there was a telegram that came saying the book has been accepted, $2,500. And we were lying in bed one night, and she said, is there a possibility that there'll be anything more from this? And I said, well, if they sell the paperback, Doubleday has a 50-50 split, and whatever they sold it for, we would get half of that money. And she said, how much do you think that might be? And I said, well, they might sell it for as much as $60,000, and if that happened, we'd get $30,000, and I could, you know, a little running room, write another book, and maybe not have to go back and teach school right away. It would be like getting a sabbatical year, you know, at school. And so we were living in a really terrible apartment in Bangor, Maine, and it was a first floor apartment. They had the Friday night fights in the apartment above us, and we had our Pinto, and that was really about all that we had. And the phone rang one day. Tabby was up visiting her parents. It was a Sunday, and it was my editor from Doubleday, and he said, we sold the paperback rights. And I said, really, how much did you get? And he said, $250,000. And we were living in a $90 a month apartment at that time. And we had a baby, and we had another baby on the way. And no, I take that back, because Joe had been born then. We had 2 kids, no money, and a brand new Pinto that my wife couldn't drive because it was the standard. He said $250,000, and the strength went out of my legs. There was a wall phone in the kitchen, and I sat down on the floor. And I said, "Did you say $25,000? And he said, "No, $250,000. And we talked about that for a while, and he hung up, and my wife was gone, and I couldn't call her because she had left her parents' house. I wanted to tell her in person anyway, and I walked around and stuff, and I thought to myself, I have to buy her a present. I've got to buy her a present, but it was Sunday, and the only place open was the Rexall drug. So I bought her a hairdryer. And you know, at that point, when you're looking ahead, it never occurred to me that anything like what has happened to me in my career would ever happen to me. All I wanted was a little running room to be able to write the next book, the one after that.
How old were you at that point?
When Carrie was written, I was 23, and
Wow.
when it was sold, because it was a long process. It was accepted for publication in '73, which would have made me, I guess, 25 at that time.
Well, you know, that's pretty amazing, though. I mean, I know it was a struggle, and you had 2 kids, but it's very young to have that kind of success.
Mm-hmm.
So I bet in a way that it contributes to the sort of confidence and boldness that you have now. You didn't go through a long period of getting rejected, it seems like.
Oh, I had a lot of rejections because I was trying to sell short stories, and I had a nail pounded into the wall. And when the rejections came in, I'd slam them on this nail. And it got to a point where the nail tore out of the wall because it had so many.
All right.
Have you've done that?
Oh, well, I haven't done the nail, but I have gotten the
But you
rejections.
did the rejections,
Yes.
didn't you?
I had a mail envelope that bulged
Oh, God.
dishearteningly.
Yeah.
All right, it's both a letter and a question. First, thank you. You are the reason I'm a journalist, and On Writing gives me the evidence I need to delete adverbs from stories that I now read as an editor. My question, how do you write love, passion, marriage, and sex so well?
Well, I'm a romantic. I am a romantic, and one of the things, if you read the book 11/22/63, it's a sentimental book. It is. It's a sentimental book, and I don't really have a problem with that as long as you don't drown in it and get all sloppy about it. And the other thing, with whether it's horror or whether it's something that has to do with love, sex, affection, murder, violence, any of those things, the trick is to try and tell the truth. I idolize Frank Norris, the guy who wrote McTeague and The Octopus. He said that some people had criticized him for writing stories about ordinary people and sort of sordid situations. And he said, what cared I? I never truckled. I told them the truth. And if you can tell the truth, you're on good grounds. And I know that people do fall in love, and people do bond together, and I like to write about that. I mean, hell, you wrote about that in The Leftovers. And you know, that guy who's at the center of that book is a very sweet man who sticks with his wife even though she's gone off and wears a white sheet and all that. And that speaks to me.
Well,
there are people in the Dickens books that speak to me that way.
And,
Little Dorrit.
And I will say, I mean, in your work, in On Writing, you talk about your wife in really just deeply devoted terms, you know, and you trust her as a reader, and you know, she's a constant reference point for you. I think you know, I can't think of as many writers who talk about being in a happy marriage quite as much as you do, and I think it has become something that is part of your worldview. A lot of narrators talk about.
Well, you know, one of the things about love and the love relationship is that I think we all understand that it's very difficult to know anybody else, including the people that you're closest to. But that might be the one relationship. If you do fall in love with somebody and if you bond, then you make a third life of the other two, which is the life where the two of you are together.
All right, well, I think with that lovely sentiment,
I don't know how lovely it was, but thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you.
Steve, you're so great.